Okay, so we're going to talk about the Cold War real quick. And by real quick, I mean real quick. I'm going to try and wrap this up in between 10 and 15 minutes and hit some of the major points just to get you taken clarified with everything. So you got to realize after World War II, the U.S. And Russia were allies. However, there were two different ideologies governing each side of the country, or each nation, I should say. In Russia, you had communism in the USSR, and in America, you had democracy and capitalism. And these were going to be the two major ideologies that are going to govern the world from 1945 on until the early 1990s, and you can make a case and even say to this very day. I think there's a couple of things that you need to realize. I think you need to realize that during the war, really, Russia and the U.S., we didn't get along with each other. It's the concept that we kind of like did. We didn't. We just realized that we were both fighting a common enemy, and that common enemy was Hitler, the worst man in the history of the world. All right, so we realized that we're stronger together, but we're not friends. We have no concept of being friends. The other thing I want you to realize is that when the death of FDR really plays a huge part in the Cold War, for the simple reason that Truman afterwards did not get along with Stalin. And with FDR is commonly referred to, or I should say Stalin was commonly referred to as Uncle Joseph, where Truman takes and does not get along with Stalin afterwards. So the stage has been set, and these two superpowers are going to set to go, or I should say, are ready to go head to head with each other and ready to take on each other, because now all of a sudden our common enemy is defeated. The catch is that we realized and we understood how bad the war was, World War II was, and we saw how bad the war was, and we weren't ready to go to another hot war or another full-blown war. So that's why this is known as the Cold War. There's actually no fighting. There's the threat of fighting. Each side has the bomb. Each side is willing to use the bomb. And it's kind of just this time period where no heated exchanges occur, but tension is still in the air. All right, so we have this idea then of the East versus the West. The easiest way, I'm convinced if I could do it, I could do it if I had the time, and I think I might try at some point in time when I'm feeling like a little dangerous. But I want to teach the Cold War using Rocky IV. You know what I mean? Rocky IV, Ivan Drago is on the one side and Rocky's on the other side, and that's exactly what you have right now. You have the big bad communist Russia on one side, and you have Rocky on the other side. And after World War II, each side, like two prized fighters, kind of go to their distinctive corners. If you've ever watched a boxing match, when someone gets knocked down or at the beginning of the match, they come out, they touch gloves, but then they turn around and they go back to their corners for the match to officially begin. After World War II, each side goes to their corners. And we start to see this almost like boxing chess match going on at this point in time. So Truman threw the first punch when he cut off financial aid to the Soviets in 1945. He then goes a step further, and he announced the United States would not recognize any state that is established by force. So in other words, the United States would not enter into any type of relationship with a state that is going to be told that you must be a certain way, which is ironic if you think about it, because that's what the U.S. does in order to try and contain communism. They try and take and keep they try and establish different states around the communist states. So as Western Europeans showed their anti-communist and anti-Soviet sentiments, the communists then slowly started to make their way out of the woodwork. Communist parties started to form in Western nations. However, they worked within the governments that already existed. So in France and in Italy, we start to see communist groups show up and turn up, but at the exact same time, they're just trying to tear down the capitalist ideas that are already there. Communists also tried to desperately convert others to the Soviet Union. In order to take and limit the spread of communism and to isolate Eastern Europe, Truman institutes something that's known as the Truman Doctrine. And that's the first thing. The Truman Doctrine offered support to any European state resisting communism and the Soviet Union. Any European state resisting communism and the Soviet Union. So we had already been offering military resistance to Greece, or assistance, to Greece and Iran. nations that Stalin was already after. All right. The United States, we knew that the European nations would struggle to rebuild on their own, and that democracy could not afford for the Soviets to rush into the rescue. So in 1946, we take it a step further, and the U.S. Secretary of State, his name is George Marshall. Marshall begins what's known as the Marshall Plan. Marshall started what was known as the Marshall Plan in hopes of exerting some sort of democratic influence. Marshall takes and he starts a plan that offers financial aid, and only financial aid to European nations. Financial aid to European nations. So now all of a sudden this takes and this, because the war costs money, puts European nations in the back pocket of the United States, or at least that was the plan. Things heated up again then in 1948 when Stalin blockaded the Western-controlled zone of Berlin. Okay, so by Marshall instituting a plan to help any type of, with financial aid, which by the way, the Marshall Plan put something like $13 billion into the kind of idea of keeping, keeping communism to a certain area. And the Soviets rejecting that plan, that sets up what's known as the Iron Curtain. The Iron Curtain is the red line right here. Take a look at the red line. So the Iron Curtain becomes known as the split between the West and the East. Germany is going to be split down the middle, with one side being governed by the Western powers and then the other side being governed by the communist powers. And Berlin even goes further, as Berlin is split itself down the middle. Now, if you'll notice here on the map, here's Berlin, the city of Berlin, and you have the U.S. sector, the British sector, and the French sector. And over here you have the Soviet sector. But really, in all actuality, Berlin is located over here in East Germany. So in 1948, Stalin blockaded the Western-controlled zone of Berlin, not allowing anyone to fly into East Germany to drop off products to this Western Berlin area that we are claiming for ourselves as a republic. The western zone of Berlin could only be reached by the Autobahn, and Stalin closed Berlin, argued that no treaty guaranteed the Western powers the right to travel through his zone of occupation. So now all of a sudden we think things are starting to heat up even further. Rather than escalate the situation with a ground attack, as his advisors suggested, the Allies chose a different approach. Truman opted for an airlift to the citizens of Berlin, and beginning in late June, aircraft flew in and out of Berlin for 324 days. So this becomes known as the Berlin Airlift. It is the first step. This is the first step toward us taking and squaring off even more so with Soviets, the Soviets at this point in time, the USSR. The planes, called Raisin bombers by the people of Berlin, carried everything from food to coal. So the idea was that if they're surrounded by communism, if we can take and keep them as kind of like this, keep this as this beacon of hope for democracy within a communist country, then maybe we can start to get the ideas of democracy and capitalism to spread further. The Soviets lifted the blockade in May 11, 1949, but the planes kept flying until September just in case Stalin changed his mind. In total, the Berlin airlift carried over 2 million tons of food and supplies to the citizens of Berlin, which was being held by Stalin. In addition to that, we also see the two governments take and engage in other activities, and this is why it's known as a Cold War, in order to take and keep each other in check. So the Berlin airlift takes and really there was no formal agreements between the members of each side. And even though the United Nations is in its initial stages, in its infancy, people really did not think it was going to work because the League of Nations had failed before. So the Western Allies felt like they needed something to prove their solidarity to each other, but also to the Soviet Union. So in 1949, the Western Allies created what was known as NATO. And NATO stands for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. The North Atlantic, it was instituted under what was known as the North Atlantic Charter, and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization stated that an armed attack against one or more of the member states in Europe or North America shall be considered an attack on all of them. Now here's the thing. This was totally created out of fear, because it was thought that the big red giant that had become Russia was about to invade as many Western European countries as it possibly could, when in all actuality the Soviets never had any intention of doing that. They realized that it would be very difficult to throw off the chains of capitalism in an area where capitalism already existed. But it was also meant as a method to contain the Soviet Union and communism from spreading further. All right, so NATO is established. The Soviets then turn around and they respond to NATO with their own pact. It becomes known as the Warsaw Pact. Warsaw being a city in Poland. The Soviet Union created the Warsaw Pact, which included Eastern Bloc countries of the Soviet Union: Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria, and Albany. And this became known as a treaty of friendship and cooperation and mutual assistance. All Eastern Communist states joined except for Yugoslavia. As with NATO, the members of the Warsaw Pact promised to retaliate if one member state was attacked. The single event that spawned the Warsaw Pact occurred in 1955, when West Germany joined NATO. East Germany naturally joined the Warsaw Pact in 1956, and because Stalin died in 1953, the Soviet responsible for the Warsaw Pact was the guy who took over after Stalin. Write down his name: Nikita Khrushchev. Khrushchev. And the Warsaw Pact, the Warsaw Pact specifically stated that member states were to practice a policy of non-interference in the affairs of other member states. And first, in the body, the Warsaw Pact, though, however, disregarded that fact twice. In 1956, the Warsaw Pact troops interfered with the Hungarian Revolution. And then, though the Warsaw Pact troops initially withdrew from after the government broke down, the troops re-entered Hungary at the request of the leader of one of the factions. The troops quickly put down the opposing faction. Then in 1968, Czechoslovakia criticized and condemned the Warsaw Pact and practically dared the Warsaw Pact to challenge the Czech military by vowing to defend its sovereignty by force if necessary. A large contingent of Warsaw Pact troops quickly brought Czechoslovakia back in line. So the Soviet Union felt it had the right, if not the duty, to intervene, any time a communist state strayed off the path. This is known as the Brezhnev Doctrine. Brezhnev. The Brezhnev Doctrine said that the Soviets had the right to interfere in any communist state that was starting to become capitalist. So in 1953, Stalin dies after an apparent stroke. However, obviously, people don't think that it's a stroke at all, and it's really, 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 if you ever get a chance, look at it, but it's really, really, really creepy how everything happens. He's eating dinner one night, and then he goes to bed, and he doesn't wake up the morning, but people don't rush to help him, and nobody tries to help him, and there's a lot of different theories as to who killed him. But in any sense, while Stalin was alive, he created what was known as the cult of personality. And the cult of personality was this idea that Stalin himself was larger than the nation. So after his death, the power struggle begins to emerge between two groups. There's this reform-minded group of communists led by a guy whose name is Nikita Khrushchev, who we already talked about. And their main rival was a guy by the name of Lavrenti Beria. Khrushchev eventually in 1955 emerges as the new leader of the Soviet Union, and he starts to denounce Stalin, and we start to move away from that cruel communism that was practiced. Khrushchev's most famous tirade against Stalin occurred in 1956 at the 20th Party Congress. In his speech, Khrushchev shocked the delegates with his indictment of Stalin's genocide, his torture and execution of loyal communists, and his failures in both foreign and domestic policy. So Khrushchev starts to de-Stalinize Russia then at that point in time. However, in 1956, things start to go the opposite way, and it seems like Khrushchev is going to be worse than Stalin. He actually is quoted as saying to the capitalist nations, "We will bury you," in a speech in 1956. What's ironic is that Khrushchev's son moves to the United States and becomes a U.S. citizen. I think that's hysterical, actually. Sorry, not ironic. I just think that's really funny. His tirade, however, when he said "we will bury you," didn't mean that he would kill the West, but rather that the Soviets will still be around when the West died. Because remember, all communists believe that eventually the capitalist epoch that's occurring is going to take an end soon. Then in 1961, he gave East Germany his blessings for the construction of what's known as the Berlin Wall. So, 1961, we see the Berlin Wall go up underneath Khrushchev's watch. The Berlin Wall officially separated East and West Germany. Now, the Berlin Wall is going to be created by communists, or the communist bloc. So the Berlin Wall is created by East Germany in an attempt to keep Western aggression out. They actually called it the Anti-Fascist Protection Wall. It was huge. Nearly 200 people died while it was being made. It's crazy, and you constantly had people from Eastern Germany trying to get into Western Germany. In 1962, we see what's known as the Cuban Missile Crisis, when Khrushchev and JFK actually go toe-to-toe with each other over nuclear weapons within Cuba. Because of Khrushchev's perceived weakness, though, because he wanted to de-Stalinize everything, we slowly start to see revolutions occurring, like the revolution that occurred in Hungary in 1956. By the early 1960s, then we start to see, especially after the Cuban Missile Crisis, we start to see people get sick and tired of Khrushchev. So we have the next individual that replaces Khrushchev in 1964. His name is Brezhnev. Brezhnev replaced him. And Brezhnev rules until the early, so takes this more hardline communist approach. So in the early 60s, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, Khrushchev is out, Brezhnev is in. This is also when we see an arms race begin to ensue. So Khrushchev's gone. That's not right, but you know what I'm saying. Brezhnev in. And that's not right either, but you know what I'm saying. And this is when we start to see the arms race occur. The arms race was just an attempt by both countries to take and create more nuclear power or nuclear warheads than the other country. We also see under Brezhnev, we see the people starting to go back to the old Stalinist kind of like idea of how to deal with problems. In 1968, the Soviet-led Warsaw Pact occupied Czechoslovakia, and to end the growth of liberal ideas and put down the bold Czech revolution that was happening, to put down what they referred to as socialism with a human face. Throughout Brezhnev's administration, Soviet relations with China worsened, especially after Soviet clashes in the 60s. And the Chinese started to get closer to the United States. So in an attempt to dissuade this from happening, and out of fear of a Chinese-American alliance, Brezhnev started a series of negotiations with the United States in the 70s that allowed the Cold War to enter what was known as the détente period. The real sign of détente had arrived was the summit between Brezhnev and Nixon that resulted in SALT I, or the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty of 1972, which didn't allow each country to develop more nuclear weapons. The détente continued when the Vietnam War ended in 1973 and culminated in the 1970s. However, the idea that we could move out of the Cold War had been planted in the minds of the individuals, and we start to see how people wanted to get away from wanted to get away from living in constant fear. Détente then continued into the 1970s with SALT II and other diplomatic negotiations between the United States and the USSR. Détente ended in the period of détente then came to an end in the 70s with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And then in 1980, the United States elects Ronald Reagan, who was bent on ending communism.